I remember the exact temperature of the troop hold when we received our deployment orders, 37 degrees Celsius. The climate controls had failed 2 weeks into our voyage, and the ship's tech adepts had reclassified the repair as non-critical to voidworthiness. We had stopped complaining by then. 1,800 men packed into a space designed for 1,200, breathing recycled air that tasted of metal and sweat, and the chemical tang of the sanitation units that processed our waste back into something the ship could use. I was 23 years old. I had been a soldier of the Astra Militarum for 5 years, 3 months, and 17 days. My name was Tovin Malik. I came from a manufacturing world called Brecht Forth, where the sky was the color of rust and the air hummed with the constant rhythm of production. My father had worked the Prometheum refineries. My mother had assembled shell casings in the munitions complex. I had 2 brothers. The Departamento Munitorum took all 3 of us on the same day, processed us through the same intake facility, and assigned us to different regiments within the same division. I never saw them again after we boarded our separate transports. The Administratum recorded our service. The separation was efficient. I understand now that efficiency was the point. The Brecht 117th Infantry Regiment. That was our designation. We were not elite. We were not specialized. We were line infantry, void-trained, equipped with standard-issue lasguns and flak armor, and the kind of faith that comes from never having seen what faith costs. Our commissar was a man named Hendrik Voss, and he had a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jawline. He told us it came from a heretic's blade on a world whose name he would not speak. He told us we would earn our own scars soon enough. He told us the Emperor protects those who serve with valor. We believed him because we had no framework for doubt. Our orders came through the Vox 3 days before we were scheduled to translate back into real space. Colonel Marston gathered the company commanders in the forward briefing compartment. The rest of us waited in the holds, speculating in the way soldiers do when information is scarce and time is abundant. Rumors spread through the regiment like fever. We were bound for Segmentum Obscurus, where the Despoiler's forces tested the Cadian Gate's defenses. We were reinforcements for a campaign against an Orc Wag that threatened 3 industrial worlds. We were being deployed to crush a rebellion on a cardinal world where the faithful had turned from the Emperor's light. The truth, when it filtered down through the chain of command, was simultaneously more mundane and more terrible. We were assigned to reinforce the garrison on Mordax's Prime, a fortress world on the edge of the Carsus sector. Intelligence reported chaos incursions along the sector's rimward border. Our regiment would bolster the defenses, conduct patrol operations, and prepare for potential siege conditions. Standard deployment. Estimated duration, 5 to 10 years. Casualties projected at 43% over the deployment period. The Commissar reminded us that to die in the Emperor's service was humanity's greatest privilege. I remember writing that number in my field journal, 43%. I tried to calculate whether I would be among the survivors. The mathematics of death fascinated me in those days, before I understood that mathematics could not predict what the universe would do to you. We translated back into real space on schedule. The warp transit had lasted 4 months and 6 days by the ship's chronometers, though time in the Imperium flows like oil on water, thick and inconsistent. 3 men had gone mad during the voyage. The ship's enforcers had executed them in the lower holds. Their bodies were processed through the reclamation units. We sang hymns for them in the makeshift chapel the regimental priests maintained in Cargo Bay 7. Their names were added to the roll of the faithful departed. The system continued. I was in the 3rd platoon of Baker Company when Lieutenant Harrow came to brief us on the final approach. He was young, maybe 26, with the kind of face that had never seen a winter or a famine. He had graduated from the Schola Progenium 3 years prior, and he carried himself with the rigid certainty of someone whose education had consisted entirely of approved texts and simulated combat scenarios. He told us we would make Planet 4 within 18 hours. He told us to inspect our equipment, review our fire team protocols, and prepare our souls for the Emperor's work. We performed the rituals of preparation because the rituals gave structure to fear. But the shipmaster did not initiate descent procedures at 18 hours. The chronometers marked 24 hours, then 36, then 48. The Vox channels filled with conflicting information. We were holding in orbit pending clearance from Surface Command. We were conducting additional system surveys. We were awaiting new orders. The officers stopped providing updates after the third day. We waited in the holds, playing cards with worn decks, cleaning weapons that were already clean, telling stories we had already heard. Waiting is its own kind of combat. It wears you down in ways that enemy fire cannot. On the fifth day, Commissar Voss assembled the entire regiment in the main cargo bay. 1,800 men in formations so tight we could smell each other's breath. He stood on a loading platform so we could all see him. His greatcoat immaculate despite the heat, his bolt pistol holstered at his side like a promise. His voice carried across the bay without amplification, trained for exactly this kind of projection. "Soldiers of the Brest 117th," he said, "we have encountered a navigational anomaly." The word anomaly hung in the air like smoke. In the Imperium, anomalies are never small things. They are tears in reality, daemon incursions, failures of the Geller field that leave ships floating in the void with their crews transformed into things that scream in frequencies human ears were not designed to process. I felt my chest tighten. Around me, men shifted their weight, hands unconsciously moving toward weapons they were not carrying. Voss continued, "The astropathic coordinates provided by the Departamento Munitorum have delivered us to the Praxis system, located in Segmentum Pacificus. We are not in the Carsus sector. We are not near Mordaxis Prime. The navigators calculate we are approximately 17,000 light-years from our intended destination." The silence that followed was absolute. 17,000 light-years. The distance was incomprehensible, meaningless, too vast to process. I tried to visualize it and failed. My mind could hold the idea of 100 kilometers, 1,000. 17,000 light-years was a number without substance, without weight. It was the distance between having a purpose and having none. "The shipmaster has transmitted a request for clarification to the nearest administrative relay station," Voss said. "We have been instructed to await response before proceeding. The Imperium's bureaucratic machinery operates with divine precision. We will receive our corrected orders in due course. Until such time, we will maintain discipline, continue our training regimens, and demonstrate the faith that defines us as servants of the Emperor. Doubt is heresy. Patience is duty. You are dismissed." We filed out of the cargo bay in silence. In the holds, conversations remained muted, as if speaking too loudly would somehow make the situation worse. I remember sitting on my bunk, a thin mattress on a metal shelf, staring at the rivets in the bulkhead above me. I counted them. 37 rivets in my field of vision. I focused on the number, because focusing on the situation required engaging with implications I was not ready to process. 17,000 light-years from where we were supposed to be. I did not know then what clerical errors looked like at the scale of the administratum. I did not understand that somewhere in the vast machinery of imperial bureaucracy, a scribe had transposed 2 digits in a coordinate string, and that this transposition had been copied into deployment orders, transmitted across half the galaxy, and uploaded into our ship's navigation systems without verification. One human error, replicated through layers of process until it became institutional reality. The Praxis system, we learned from the ship's surveyor servitors, contained 7 planets. The third planet was inhabited, a minor agri-world with a population of approximately 4 million, all engaged in producing grain for tithe shipments to more important worlds. There was no war here, no Xenos incursion, no heretic rebellion, no daemon manifestation. The planetary governor maintained a PDF force of perhaps 2,000 soldiers, equipped with stubbers and autoguns, adequate for suppressing food riots and enforcing tithe collection. The system had not seen combat in 340 years. The fortress we were supposed to garrison did not exist. Mordax's Prime, with its massive bastions and void shield generators and artillery emplacements, was 17,000 light-years away, defending a sector we would never see. The response from the administrative relay station arrived 6 weeks later. 6 weeks awaiting in orbit, conducting endless equipment drills, running simulation exercises in the ship's training compartments, burning through our physical and spiritual reserves in a void without purpose. The astropathic transmission was brief, encoded in the standard cipher protocols, and delivered to Colonel Marston in the secure communications chamber. He read it 3 times, the communications officer later reported, before requesting it be transmitted again to verify accuracy. The message instructed the Brecht 117th to proceed to Mordax's Prime as originally ordered. No acknowledgement of the navigational error. No explanation of how we were supposed to traverse 17,000 light-years. No revised coordinates or alternative assignments. Just the original order repeated, as if repetition would somehow unmake the distance between where we were and where we were supposed to be. Colonel Marston petitioned for clarification. He filed the request through proper channels, routed through the administratum relay, flagged with appropriate urgency codes. The bureaucracy acknowledged receipt of his query and assigned it a processing number 7743, Gamma/227. Estimated response time, 6 to 8 months. The Imperium processes millions of requests every day. Ours was one among millions. The system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, with the cold efficiency of a machine that cannot distinguish between urgent and routine, because all things are routine when measured against eternity. We could not remain in orbit indefinitely. The ship's stores were adequate for 6 months of operation, perhaps 8 with rationing, but we had already consumed a month of those supplies during transit and during our waiting. The shipmaster, a man I never met but whose decisions shaped the trajectory of my life, made the calculation that remaining in orbit would eventually result in starvation. He negotiated with the planetary governor of Praxis III for permission to make planetfall and establish a temporary garrison pending receipt of corrected orders. The governor, a man named Castellan who had inherited the position from his father and whose primary concern was maintaining tithe quotas, agreed. He had no reason to refuse. An Imperial Guard regiment, even one that had arrived by mistake, represented no threat to his authority and might prove useful if any of his farmers grew dissatisfied with their quotas. He allocated us a region on the planet's southern continent, an empty stretch of plains where an old mining complex had been abandoned a century prior when the ore veins ran dry. The structures were still standing, prefabricated hab blocks and storage facilities constructed from rockcrete and corroded steel. It was not a fortress, it was barely a garrison, but it was better than slow death in orbit. We made planetfall on a morning when the local star hung low and red on the horizon, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. The atmosphere was breathable, 31% oxygen, nitrogen and trace elements within human tolerance. The gravity was 0.97 standard, close enough to Brecht IV that my body adjusted within hours. The temperature was cool, maybe 15 degrees Celsius, and the wind carried the smell of growing things, wheat and barley and something else I could not identify. Some local crop variant engineered for this world's specific soil chemistry. I had not smelled growing things in 5 years. The manufacturing world of my birth produced only metal and chemical byproducts, and the sour stench of human bodies laboring in enclosed spaces. This world smelled clean. It smelled wrong. We established our camp in the abandoned mining complex with the efficiency of soldiers who have been trained for exactly this kind of operation. Perimeter defenses erected, guard rotations scheduled, equipment inventoried and stored. The regimental medicae established an aid station in one of the old administrative buildings. The commissariat claimed a central structure for command operations. The priests consecrated the building as a field chapel and began conducting daily services according to the approved liturgies. We built a garrison in a place that needed no garrison, following protocols because protocols were all we had. I was assigned to 3rd Squad, 2nd Platoon, Baker Company. My squad leader was a man named Sergeant Cullen, 34 years old, with hands like gravel and a voice that carried across open ground. He had served on 2 previous deployments, survived both, and carried a collection of scars across his back that he showed us once in the wash facilities. "Last fire," he said. From a firefight on a jungle world whose name had been classified after the campaign ended. He told us he had learned to sleep through artillery bombardment and to eat field rations without tasting them. He told us that surviving was a skill you learned by watching men who had not learned it die. I listened to him because he had information I needed, information the Schola Progenium could not teach, information written in scar tissue and nightmares. In my squad, there was a man named Prentice who had been a clerk before conscription and who could recite regulations from memory. There was Harvin, who never spoke about his life before service and who cleaned his lasgun with the focus of religious devotion. There was Jace, who was 19 and who missed his wife with an intensity that seemed to physically hurt him, a pain he carried in his chest like shrapnel. And there was Oren. Oren was 25, tall and thin with the kind of build that suggested childhood malnutrition, all angles and prominent bones. His homeworld was Delve Eyes, a mining colony in the Segmentum Tempestus, where men descended into darkness and came back changed, if they came back at all. He had worked the deep shafts for 6 years before the Munitorum took him. He told me once that the guard had been a relief, that at least as a soldier you fought enemies you could see, not the slow collapse of stone and the constant fear of being buried alive. He had gray eyes, pale like winter skies, and a habit of watching things without comment, as if he were cataloguing everything he saw for some future purpose I could not identify. We became friends in the way soldiers do, not through grand gestures or shared philosophy, but through proximity and repetition. We stood watch together on the perimeter. We shared rations in the mess hall. We played regicide in the evenings, hunched over a worn board someone had carved from scrap wood. He was better at it than I was, thought 3 moves ahead while I struggled with 2. He never gloated when he won. He would just reset the pieces and start again, patient and methodical. I learned more about strategy from those games than from any tactical briefing. The first month on Praxis 3 passed in a rhythm of routine. Morning formation at 0600. Physical training. Weapons maintenance. Patrol drills across the plains, marching in full kit under the red sun while Sergeant Cullen called cadence and corrected our formations. Midday meal. Tactical instruction. Evening formation. Chapel services for those who attended, which was most of us, because faith was easier than doubt, and the priests offered certainty in a situation defined by confusion. Then sleep, 8 hours if you were lucky, less if you pulled watch rotation. We waited for orders that did not come. The second month was identical to the first. We continued training operations, running scenarios against imaginary enemies, conducting mock assaults on positions that held no strategic value. The commissars walked among us, observing, correcting, reminding us that vigilance was eternal and that the Emperor's enemies would test us when we least expected it. But the Emperor's enemies did not come. The plains remained empty. The sky remained clear. The Vox channels carried only routine traffic and the occasional astropathic bulletin about distant wars that had nothing to do with us. Some men began to relax. I observed it in the way they carried themselves, the slight loosening of posture, the conversations that drifted from tactics to memories of home. Jace talked about his wife more frequently, describing the sound of her laugh, the way she braided her hair. Prentice started teaching basic literacy to men who had never learned, using field manuals as textbooks. Harvin maintained his weapon protocols without deviation, but even he began to smile occasionally, small expressions that cracked his usual severity. I did not relax. I could not identify why. Some instinct in my chest suggested that relaxation was dangerous, that this peace was not real but merely a delay. That purpose would return, and would return violently. I maintained my routines with the same intensity as the first week. Orin noticed. He mentioned it one evening while we played regicide. "You still think we're going to war," he said. "Not a question, an observation." I moved a piece, sacrificing a pawn to protect my officer. We are at war. We've always been at war. We're sitting in an empty field on a quiet world waiting for bureaucrats to figure out where we're supposed to be. He captured my pawn, advanced his line. That's not war. That's administrative error. The error will be corrected. We'll receive our orders. And if we don't? I had no answer for that. The possibility of not receiving orders, of existing in this state indefinitely, was not something I had allowed myself to process. Orders were certainty. Without orders, we were not soldiers. We were just men with weapons, waiting. Orin studied the board, moved his officer into position. Check. I stared at the pieces, calculating options, finding none that did not end in defeat. You're better at this than I am. My father taught me, in the deep shafts between extraction shifts. Said it kept your mind sharp, kept you from thinking too much about the weight of all that stone above you. He leaned back, gray eyes distant. He died in a collapse when I was 17, buried under 300 meters of rock. They never recovered his body. The company logged him as processing loss and hired his replacement the next day. I worked the same shaft for 3 more years before the guard took me. I did not know what to say. The Imperium had taken his father, and then taken him, processed them both through its machinery, and would eventually process us all until nothing remained but statistics in some vast archive. I moved my officer out of check, delaying the inevitable. "Your move," I said. He checkmated me 4 moves later. At the end of the 3rd month, Colonel Marston assembled the regiment and informed us that our query to the administratum had been acknowledged and elevated to a higher priority processing tier. New estimated response time, 3 to 4 months. The machinery was working. We would receive clarification. We were instructed to maintain our training regimens and demonstrate the discipline expected of Imperial soldiers. He dismissed us without further comment. In the 4th month, supply shipments from Praxis III's agricultural zones began arriving at our garrison. The planetary governor had calculated that feeding 1,800 soldiers was more efficient than allowing us to deplete our ship-based stores, which would require replacement at Imperial expense. We began receiving fresh bread, actual grain instead of reconstituted nutrient paste, along with vegetables grown in the planet's southern farms. The food tasted strange after years of processed rations, flavors too complex, textures that required chewing. Some men complained. Most adapted. The body learns to accept what the system provides. We also began receiving requests from the governor's administration. Minor security concerns. A farming collective in the Western District had reported equipment theft. Could we spare a squad to investigate? A storm had damaged a grain processing facility. Could our engineers assist with repairs? There was a dispute between 2 farming communities over water rights. Could an Imperial officer mediate? Colonel Marston refused the first 3 requests. We were not a PDF force. We were not a labor battalion. We were Imperial Guard, awaiting deployment to our assigned war zone. The governor's security concerns were not our responsibility. But the requests continued, and the colonel's resolve gradually eroded under the weight of practical reality. We were consuming the planet's resources. We were occupying valuable land. If we were going to remain here indefinitely, we would need to demonstrate value to the planetary administration. After 2 months of refusals, he authorized limited support operations. I was part of the squad assigned to investigate the equipment theft. We traveled west in a Chimera transport, 8 soldiers and Sergeant Cullen, rolling across dirt roads through fields of wheat that stretched to the horizon. The farmers who had reported the theft were a collective of 30 families living in prefabricated hab blocks identical to our own garrison structures. They grew wheat, processed it in a local mill, and shipped it to the planetary capital for off-world export. They worked 16-hour days during harvest season. Their children worked beside them as soon as they were old enough to carry tools. The Imperium required 9,000 tons of grain from their collective each year. They had never failed to meet their quota. The theft had occurred 3 nights prior. Someone had broken into their equipment storage facility and stolen a grain hauler, a massive tracked vehicle worth approximately 4 years of the collective surplus production. The thieves had cut through a chain-link fence, bypassed the facility's locking mechanisms, and driven the hauler away without triggering any alarms. The collective's elder, a man named Torvus with sun-weathered skin and hands like tree roots, showed us the damage. Professional work, Sergeant Cullen observed. Whoever took it knew what they were doing. We conducted the investigation according to our training, examined the entry point, documented the lock mechanism's condition, searched the surrounding area for tracks or other evidence. Found nothing useful. The thieves had left no clear trail, and the dirt roads between farming collectives were used by hundreds of vehicles daily. The hauler could be anywhere in the Western District by now, stripped for parts or repainted and sold to another collective that would ask no questions. Sergeant Cullen filed his report. No suspects identified. Minimal evidence recovered. Recommended increased security measures, but acknowledged the collective lacked resources for advanced monitoring systems. The theft would be logged, added to some planetary database, and forgotten. We returned to garrison. The investigation had consumed 3 days. It was the most purposeless activity I had engaged in since joining the Guard. I had trained to fight humanity's enemies across 1,000,000 worlds. I was investigating farm equipment theft on a peaceful agri-world. The gap between those two realities was wide enough to fall through. Oren had been assigned to a different detail, helping repair a water purification system in the Southern District. When we returned, I found him in the mess hall, eating fresh bread and reading a technical manual on Vox equipment maintenance. He looked up when I sat down across from him. How was the investigation? Pointless. We found nothing. The colonel's turning us into PDF enforcers. He considered that, chewing slowly. We have to be something. Can't just sit here training for a war we're never going to fight. We will fight. When the orders come through, we'll ship out to Mordaxus Prime, and this will all have been. I searched for the word. A delay. It's been 4 months, Tovin. How long before you admit we're not going anywhere? I did not answer. I ate my bread in silence, tasting grain that had been grown in fields we now patrolled like occupation troops. The bread was good. That was the worst part. It tasted better than anything I had eaten in years, and I resented it for that. The response from the administratum arrived in the 6th month. Colonel Marston read it to the assembled regiment in the same cargo bay where we had first learned of the navigational error. The transmission acknowledged our situation, confirmed that the navigational coordinates had contained an error, apologized for any inconvenience, and instructed us to proceed to Mordaxus Prime, as originally ordered. The message was identical to the previous response, word for word, as if the bureaucracy had simply transmitted the same document twice, unable or unwilling to process the actual nature of our query. The colonel filed a new request for clarification. He detailed our situation with explicit precision. Wrong sector, 17,000 light-years from destination, insufficient fuel reserves for transit, requesting revised assignment or extraction. He flagged the request as urgent. He included supporting documentation from the shipmaster regarding our void worthiness and supply status. He transmitted it through the administratum relay and received an automated acknowledgement. New processing number 8841, Delta Tertius 193. Estimated response time 8 to 12 months. 8 to 12 months. I remember standing in formation, listening to those numbers, and feeling something inside me crack. Not break. Crack. A fissure opening in the foundation of certainty I had built my identity upon. I was a soldier of the Astra Militarum. Soldiers had purpose. Soldiers served. But service required direction, and direction required orders that made sense. And our orders were fragments of bureaucratic noise, signifying nothing. I held my last gun and stood at attention and maintained discipline because discipline was all I had left, but the crack widened with each passing day. We continued our support operations for the planetary government, more investigations, more repairs, more mediation of disputes between farming collectives who could not afford to take their grievances to the planet's official arbitrators. We became a de facto PDF force, providing services the governor could not afford to maintain himself. Some men adapted to this role. Prentice seemed to thrive in it, using his administrative skills to help farmers navigate tithe documentation. Others grew increasingly restless, training routines performed with diminishing intensity. Conversations in the barracks drifting toward dangerous territory. Speculation about desertion, about settling here permanently, about the possibility that the Imperium had forgotten us entirely. Commissar Voss walked among us more frequently. His presence was a reminder that doubt was heresy, that patience was duty, that the Emperor's plans were vast beyond our comprehension and questioning them was spiritual weakness. He did not need to execute anyone. The threat of execution, hovering unspoken in every conversation he joined, was sufficient to maintain order. Fear is an effective tool. It preserves discipline even when discipline has no clear purpose. In the 8th month, something changed. Not in our situation, in us. Jace stopped talking about his wife. I noticed it during evening mess, the absence of her name in his conversations, like a gap in breathing. For 7 months, he had spoken of her constantly, obsessive recitation of memories, as if repetition could preserve what distance was eroding. Then, over the course of perhaps 3 weeks, she vanished from his speech. He still wrote letters, carefully composed on requisitioned paper, but he no longer shared their contents. He folded them, sealed them in envelopes made from ration packaging, and placed them in his footlocker. There was no astropathic relay that could transmit personal correspondence across 17,000 light-years. The letters accumulated in his footlocker like artifacts from a dead religion. He wrote them anyway because the ritual mattered more than the destination. I asked him about it once. We were on watch together, standing perimeter duty in the pre-dawn hours when the air turned cold and the horizon bled from black to gray. He was silent for a long time before answering. "I can't remember her face anymore," he said. His voice was flat, factual reporting data. "I remember that I loved her. I remember getting married. I remember our last night together before I shipped out. But when I try to see her face, it's just," he gestured vaguely, "impressions. Brown hair, she had brown hair, I know that. But I can't see it. I can't see her." I did not tell him that I was forgetting too. My mother's face had degraded to fragments. The shape of her hands, the sound of her voice saying my name, disconnected pieces that no longer assembled into a complete person. My brothers were even more distant, already half erased by 5 years of service before we ever arrived at Praxis 3. Memory requires maintenance. When you have no images to reference, no voices to hear, no physical anchors to hold on to, the past becomes hypothesis. I remember that I had a mother. The statement was true, but the person behind it was dissolving like morning frost under the red sun. We stood our watch in silence. At dawn, Sergeant Cullen arrived with our relief, and we returned to barracks to sleep. Jace placed his latest letter in his footlocker. I counted 37 letters in the stack, one for each week we had been here. Evidence of devotion to someone he could no longer visualize. The Emperor protects, the priests told us, but the Emperor did not protect memory. That was mortality's tax, collected whether you paid willingly or not. The 9th month brought the first death. Not combat, nothing so purposeful. Private Kellis, 19 years old, from a hive world called Thraxus Prime. He had been assigned to a repair detail, helping reinforce a grain silo's foundation in the northern district. The silo was 200 years old, built before current engineering standards, and the foundation had developed stress fractures from decades of loaded weight. The work was routine, supervised by our engineering corps, performed according to safety protocols. The foundation collapsed anyway. 300 tons of rockcrete and steel and stored grain came down in 7 seconds. Kellis and 2 other soldiers were caught in the collapse zone. We excavated for 6 hours, moving rubble by hand when the equipment proved too imprecise. We recovered 3 bodies. Kellis was the only one we could identify visually. The other 2 required dental records and fingerprint analysis from the Medici. The regimental priests performed the burial rites in our field cemetery, a plot of ground at the garrison's eastern edge that we had consecrated but never expected to use. Not like this. We had anticipated combat casualties, deaths that meant something, sacrifices made in the Emperor's name against his enemies. Not construction accidents, not waste. Commissar Voss delivered the eulogy. He spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of how death in the Emperor's service was humanity's highest calling regardless of circumstance. The words were correct. The liturgy was proper. But standing there in formation, watching the Medici lower Kellis into the ground, I felt the wrongness of it settle in my chest like radiation sickness. This was not sacrifice. This was simply death. Meaningless and bureaucratic, the kind that happened to construction workers and factory laborers, not soldiers. Kellis had trained for war. He had survived the brutal selection process, the conditioning, the indoctrination. He had been forged into an instrument of imperial violence, and he had died repairing a grain silo for farmers who would never know his name. We filled in the grave. We sang the hymns, we returned to garrison, and continued our routines because continuing was what soldiers did. But something had shifted. I observed it in conversations, in the way men held themselves. We had buried our first casualty, and the death had meant nothing. There was no glory in it, no purpose, no consolation except the empty promise that the Emperor would recognize his service in whatever afterlife doctrine claimed awaited the faithful. I did not know if I believed that anymore. The crack that had opened in my certainty during the 6th month was widening. Oren found me that evening in the makeshift chapel, sitting in the back row of salvaged chairs, staring at the altar the priests had constructed from scrap metal and devotional iconography. I was not praying. I did not know what prayer would accomplish. I was simply sitting in a space designated for meaning, hoping meaning would manifest. He sat beside me without speaking. We remained like that for perhaps 10 minutes, the silence broken only by the distant sound of evening formation being called outside. Finally, he spoke. "You're losing your faith." Not a question. An observation. Oren had always been perceptive, watching and cataloging and understanding things I had not yet admitted to myself. "I don't know what I'm losing," I said. "I know what I came here with. Purpose, direction, certainty about who I was and what I was supposed to do. All of that was conditional on the system working. Orders that made sense. A war to fight. Death that meant something. We don't have any of that." "We have each other," Oren said. "The regiment. That's not nothing. It's not enough." He considered that, gray eyes reflecting the candlelight from the altar. What would be enough? I stood, left the chapel, and returned to barracks. I cleaned my lasgun for the 2nd time that day, disassembling and reassembling it with the mechanical precision of ritual. The weapon was functional. It would fire when required. But fire at what? Empty air? Training targets? Farmers who failed to meet their quotas? I reassembled the weapon and placed it in my footlocker and lay on my bunk staring at the rivets in the bulkhead. I had stopped counting them somewhere around the 4th month. Now I started again. 37 rivets. The same number as before. Constants in a situation where nothing else remained constant. The 10th month brought a supply ship from the subsector capital, a small transport carrying replacement parts and medical supplies for the planetary government. It also carried mail, personal correspondence for Praxis 3's population, routed through the Administratum's vast postal system. There was nothing for us. We had been in the Administratum's databases as stationed at Mordaxus Prime when the mail had been processed. Our current location was an error not yet propagated through the bureaucracy's records. Letters from home, if there were any, were being delivered to a fortress world 17,000 light-years away, where they would accumulate in some unclaimed mail depot until someone eventually processed them as undeliverable. Some men took that harder than others. I watched Jace's face when the mail call produced nothing for the regiment, watched something die behind his eyes. He returned to barracks, removed all 37 letters from his footlocker, and burned them in one of the waste incinerators. He did not write another letter after that. The ritual had sustained him through 10 months of waiting. The revelation that the letters were not even reaching the mail system, that they were simply accumulating in his footlocker as physical evidence of futility, broke something that faith could not repair. He became quiet after that, performed his duties without complaint but without engagement, a machine executing protocols. I tried to reach him, attempted conversation in the mess hall, during watch rotations, in the evenings when the regiment gathered for chapel services. He responded with monosyllables, functional communication that conveyed information without connection. Sergeant Cullen noticed. He assigned Jace to additional training details, keeping him busy, the military solution to despair. It did not help. Busyness is not purpose, it is simply motion, and motion without direction is just entropy. In the 11th month, the second response from the administratum arrived. Colonel Marston read it to us in the assembly area, his voice carefully neutral, the discipline of command maintaining composure despite content. The transmission acknowledged our query, apologized for the delay in processing, and informed us that our case had been referred to the Departamento Munitorum's Coordination Office for evaluation. Estimated resolution time? 12 to 18 months. The message included a reference number for tracking purposes and reminded us that patience was a virtue the Emperor valued in his servants. 12 to 18 months. On top of the 11 we had already waited. The men absorbed this information in silence. No protests, no outbursts, just silent calculation, each soldier performing the mathematics of their own endurance. 12 to 18 more months of garrison duty in a place that did not need a garrison. On a world that had nothing to do with the war we had been conscripted to fight, waiting for bureaucrats who processed our existence as one file among billions. Colonel Marston dismissed us. I walked back to barracks with Oren, neither of us speaking. What was there to say? The system was working as designed. We were experiencing the Imperium's standard operational efficiency, the same machinery that moved armies across the galaxy and sustained humanity across 1 million worlds. It was not broken. This was how it functioned. We had simply never been on this side of it before, never been the ones waiting for the machine to process us, never understood that from inside the gears, the grinding was eternal. That night, Jace took his service knife and opened his wrists in the shower facilities. He did it after lights out, when the facilities were empty, arranged himself in the drainage area so the blood would flow cleanly into the recycling system, efficient even in death, following protocols that minimized inconvenience. Harvin found him during a routine security patrol at 200 hours. The Medicae estimated he had been dead for approximately 90 minutes. The blood had already stopped flowing. The facility's recycling system had processed most of it. The body remained pale and empty, eyes open, staring at ceiling tiles that were identical to the ceiling tiles in every Imperial facility I had ever served in. Commissar Voss declared it a failure of faith and ordered the body denied burial rites. Suicide was heresy, rejection of the Emperor's gift of life, abandonment of duty. The corpse would be processed through the planetary reclamation system, reduced to components, recycled into agricultural supplements. Jace's name would be struck from the regimental rolls. His service would be nullified. He would become administratively unpersoned, erased from record as if he had never existed. We assembled for the announcement in the pre-dawn darkness, standing formation while Voss explained the situation with clinical precision. Jace had failed. Jace had betrayed his oath. Jace would not be mourned. The Emperor recognized only those who served faithfully until death claimed them in his service, not those who took their own lives in cowardice. The commissar's words were doctrinally correct. They followed established protocol. They were also absolutely empty, noise masquerading as meaning, bureaucratic recitation of rules that existed to maintain control rather than address reality. I stood at attention, maintaining discipline, and felt the crack inside me widen into a chasm. Jace was dead because he could not endure indefinite purposelessness. He was dead because the woman he loved had become a memory he could no longer visualize. He was dead because the Emperor, if the Emperor even existed as more than institutional mythology, did not protect those who served him. The Emperor consumed them, processed them through his machinery, and discarded them when they broke. Jace had broken. I was watching how the system handled breakage. They took his body away in a disposal container. I never saw it again. His bunk was reassigned to a replacement from 4th Platoon. His footlocker was inventoried and his possessions redistributed to regiment supply. Within 48 hours, no physical evidence of his existence remained in our barracks. The system had processed him completely, efficiently, with the same methodical thoroughness it applied to all things. I understood then what we were. Not soldiers. Components, interchangeable parts in a machine so vast that individual failure was irrelevant. Jace's function had ceased. The machine continued. Orin found me again that evening. Not in the chapel this time. I could not enter the chapel after Voss's declaration. The space designated for meaning had become intolerable. Every icon and candle and prayer a lie I could no longer force myself to swallow. Instead, I sat outside the garrison's perimeter, watching the sun set over fields of wheat that grew and ripened, and were harvested in cycles that predated our arrival and would continue long after we left. The wheat did not care about purpose. It grew because growing was its nature. Perhaps that was wisdom. Perhaps consciousness was the Emperor's cruelest gift, the ability to recognize meaninglessness while being unable to escape it. Orin sat beside me on the rockcrete barrier. He did not speak immediately. We watched the sun descend, the sky bleeding through amber to red to purple, the first stars emerging in the darkness. He had brought 2 canteens of water. He offered me one. I drank. The water tasted of recycling system chemicals, processed from our waste and made potable through filtration that removed everything except the knowledge of what it had been. "I'm not going to tell you it gets better," Orin said. "I'm not going to quote doctrine or tell you the Emperor has a plan. I don't know if the Emperor exists, and if he does, I don't know if he cares about us. What I know is that you're still here, you're still breathing, and while you're breathing, you can choose what happens next." Choose what? We're trapped here, waiting for bureaucrats who will take years to process our request. There's no choice. There's always a choice. Jace chose his ending. You can choose to keep going, not because there's purpose, not because there's meaning, but because you're not done yet. He paused. I'm not done yet either, and I'd rather not be undone alone. I looked at him, gray eyes in the gathering darkness, steady and clear. Orin had worked the deep shafts of Delve eyes, descended into darkness every day knowing the stone might collapse and bury him. He had watched his father die that way. He understood better than I did that existence was not about purpose. It was about enduring despite the absence of purpose, about choosing continuation when every rational calculation suggested stopping. He had already made that choice before the guard took him. He was offering to help me make it too. "I don't know if I can," I said. "You don't have to know. You just have to not stop." We sat there until full darkness, until the stars filled the sky in configurations unfamiliar to both of us, constellations that belonged to this sector and not the ones we had come from. Then we returned to barracks. I cleaned my lascan. I lay on my bunk. I stared at the ceiling rivets. I counted 37. I fell asleep. I woke the next morning. I continued. The months blurred after Jace's death. 12, 13, 14. 15, we conducted our garrison duties with mechanical efficiency. Patrol rotations, equipment maintenance, support operations for the planetary government. We investigated thefts, mediated disputes, repaired infrastructure. We had become what the Colonel had resisted us becoming, a PDF force in Imperial Guard uniforms, providing services to a world that needed police, not soldiers. Some men found satisfaction in the work. Prentice had established a literacy program that served 3 farming collectives. Harvin had trained a local militia in basic weapons maintenance. They were building something here, creating connections, finding purpose in service even when the service was not what they had trained for. I could not do that. Every patrol felt like betrayal. Every repair detail felt like waste. I had been forged into a weapon, trained for war, indoctrinated with the necessity of human survival against a universe that wanted us dead. And I was fixing grain silos. The gap between what I was and what I was being used for created a dissonance I could not resolve. I performed my duties because refusing meant execution. Commissar Voss walked among us still, his presence a constant reminder that discipline was not optional. But I was performing, executing protocols without inhabiting them. I had become the thing I had observed in Jace before his death, a machine that looked like a person. Orin noticed. Of course he noticed. He always noticed. He kept himself close, engineering situations where we worked together, assigned to the same details, standing the same watch rotations. He did not try to fix me. He did not offer empty reassurances. He simply remained present, a constant in the dissolution, evidence that connection was still possible even when everything else was falling apart. We played regicide in the evenings. He still won most games. I was learning, adapting, occasionally forcing draws when I could not force victory. The games were meaningless. They mattered more than anything else. In the 18th month, the 3rd response from the administratum arrived. I was on perimeter watch when the Vox announcement crackled across the garrison frequency, ordering all personnel to assembly. We gathered in the same space where we had gathered for every previous announcement, 1,800 men in formation, diminished by natural attrition to 1,732. We had lost 68 soldiers to accidents, illness, suicides, and 1 case of desertion where a man had simply walked into the wilderness and never returned. The commissariat had declared them all failures of one kind or another. Their names were struck. The system continued. Colonel Marston stood on the platform, the same platform where Commissar Voss had first told us about the navigational anomaly. He looked older. The 18 months had aged him in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to miss. His uniform remained immaculate, but the man inside it had changed, compressed under the weight of maintaining order and discipline in a situation that rewarded neither. He read the administratum transmission without preamble. Our case had been reviewed by the Departamento Munitorum's coordination office. The navigational error had been confirmed and logged. Our request for revised orders had been processed and approved. We were instructed to proceed to Mordaxis Prime as originally ordered, using corrected navigational coordinates attached to the transmission. The administratum apologized for any inconvenience caused by the error and reminded us that the Emperor valued all who served with faith and patience. Silence. Absolute silence. 1,732 men absorbing information that should have been a relief, should have been salvation, but landed like a blow. 18 months we had waited. 18 months of garrison duty, of watching purpose erode, of burying men who had died for nothing. And now, finally, we had our orders. Proceed to the war we were always supposed to fight. The colonel dismissed us. We filed out of assembly in silence. In the barracks, men gathered in small groups, processing what this meant. We would ship out within the month, as soon as the transport could complete resupply operations. We would navigate to the Carsus sector, a journey that would take another 4 months if the warp currents were favorable. We would arrive at Mordaxis Prime and join the garrison and fight whatever war waited for us there. Purpose had been restored. We were soldiers again, not PDF, not garrison troops, not abandoned components waiting for the machine to remember we existed. I should have felt relief. I felt nothing. No anticipation, no fear. No sense of restored meaning. Just emptiness, vast and cold, the same emptiness I had felt standing at Jace's informal memorial before Voss had forbidden mourning him. Purpose had been taken from us for 18 months. Now it was being returned as if the gap had never existed, as if we could simply resume being soldiers after 18 months of being something else. The administratum had processed our request. The system had worked. We would continue. I found Orin in the equipment storage area, inventorying Lusgun power packs in preparation for shipment. He looked up when I entered, registered my expression, set down his data slate. "You heard?" he said. "We're shipping out. Should be good news. Should be." He studied me, gray eyes searching for something I was not sure I still possessed. "You're not coming back from this, are you? Whatever broke in you during these 18 months, getting orders isn't going to fix it." "I don't know what I am anymore," I said. "I know what I was. Soldier. Imperial Guardsman. Servant of the Emperor. I believed in all of it. The necessity. The purpose. The idea that my service mattered in some vast calculation I couldn't see. But we've been here 18 months, Orin. 18 months of waiting for bureaucrats to correct a clerical error. Jace died because he couldn't endure it. 67 others died or broke or vanished. And the system that created this situation, that left us here, that failed to protect us or even acknowledge our situation efficiently, that system is the same one giving us our orders now. How do I trust that? How do I believe the next order has any more meaning than the last one? You don't, Orin said. You can't. But you follow them anyway, because the alternative is what Jace chose, and I don't think you're ready for that. How do you do it? How do you keep going without believing? I believe in one thing, he said. You, the men in this regiment, the connections we've built while we've been trapped here. That's small. That's not the Emperor or the Imperium or humanity's grand destiny, but it's real. And it's enough to keep me breathing one more day. Then I do it again the next day. I wanted to believe him. I wanted that to be sufficient, but I could feel the crack inside me, the fissure that had started in the 6th month and widened with Jace's death. Reaching critical mass, something was breaking in me that orders could not repair. I was functional. I would follow commands. I would board the transport and navigate to Mordaxus Prime and fight whatever war awaited me there. But I would be doing it as a machine executes programming, not as a person inhabiting purpose. The distinction felt important. I could not articulate why. We shipped out 32 days later. The transport was the same vessel that had brought us here, its void-worthiness certified by tech priests who conducted the proper rituals and pronounced the machine spirit satisfied. We loaded our equipment, formed up in the cargo holds, and waited for translation into the warp. The last thing I saw of Praxis 3 was its southern continent receding through a viewport, endless fields of wheat rippling in wind I could no longer feel. 18 months we had been there. We had changed nothing. The planet would continue its cycles without us, processing grain, meeting quotas, serving the Imperium's machinery exactly as it always had. The warp transit took 4 months and 11 days. 3 more men went mad. The ship's enforcers executed them in the lower holds. We sang hymns. Names were logged. The system continued. We translated back into real space in the Carsus sector. The Vox channels immediately filled with military traffic, encrypted transmissions between fleet elements and ground forces. The shipmaster hailed system command, transmitted our credentials, and requested approach vectors to Mordaxus Prime. There was a long silence. Then a response came through, audio only. A Vox operator whose voice carried the flat exhaustion of someone who had been processing communications for too long without sleep. Brecht, 117th Infantry Regiment confirmed identity. Be advised, Mordaxus Prime defensive operations concluded 23 months ago. Chaos incursion repelled, garrison requirements reduced to maintenance levels. Your regiment is no longer required for deployment. Stand by for reassignment instructions. 23 months ago, While we had been sitting on Praxis 3, waiting for the administratum to process our request, the war we were supposed to fight had been fought and concluded without us. We had waited 18 months for orders to proceed to a war zone that no longer existed. The transport we had taken, the 4 months in the warp, all of it had delivered us to irrelevance. We were not needed. We had never been needed. The defensive operations had been conducted by other regiments, soldiers who had received the correct coordinates, who had arrived on schedule and fought and died and achieved whatever victory looked like in this sector. We had missed it, not through cowardice or failure, but through bureaucratic error, and the time it took to correct it. Colonel Marston requested clarification. System Command transmitted our reassignment. Proceed to the subsector logistics depot at Vanis Station. Await further deployment orders. Estimated processing time for new assignment 6 to 8 months. We altered course. We navigated to Vanis Station. We disembarked into a depot facility that housed 40,000 soldiers from a dozen different regiments, all awaiting assignment, all processed through the same bureaucratic machinery that had created our situation. We were given barracks in Section 12, Level 4. Adequate environmental controls this time, 39 degrees Celsius, acceptable for human habitation. We were instructed to maintain training regimens and standby readiness. We waited. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The depot processed logistics for a dozen active war zones across the subsector. We watched supplies move through, watched regiments ship out to conflicts that had nothing to do with us, watched the machinery operate with vast efficiency that somehow never included us in its calculations. Oren and I stood watch together on the depot's observation deck in our 3rd month there. We could see ships translating in and out of the system, massive transports and escort vessels and the occasional Navy cruiser. The Imperium's war machine in motion, endless and eternal, fighting battles across the galaxy while we stood on a depot platform watching. 30 months, Oren said. 18 on Praxis 3, 4 in transit, 3 here. 30 months since we left Brecht the 4th. The war we were supposed to fight is over. We'll be assigned to a new war eventually, transported to a new sector, and the cycle will repeat. This is what service actually looks like. Not glory, not purpose, just waiting for the machine to tell us where to stand next. Does it bother you? I asked. He considered the question, watching ships move through the darkness. It used to. On Delve Eyes, I thought the guard would be different. Clearer purpose, enemies you could see. But it's the same machinery, just pointed at different problems. The deep shafts extracted ore for the Imperium. The guard extracts security. Both systems process people until they break, then get replacements. I made peace with that a long time ago. I haven't, I said, made peace with it. I know. He turned to face me, gray eyes reflecting starlight. But you're still here. You're still functioning. That counts for something. But I know I'm glad you're here. That's small. That's selfish. But it's what I have. I looked at him. This man I had played regicide with for 30 months, whose presence had kept me functional when functionality seemed pointless. Connection in the absence of meaning. Purpose constructed from human warmth in a system designed to eliminate warmth as inefficient. It was not enough, but it was what we had. The response from the Departamento Munitorum arrived 6 months after we reached Vanis Station. The Brecht 117th was being reassigned to garrison duty on Helix 7, a mining world in the adjacent sector requiring security forces to suppress worker unrest. Not a war. Not a combat deployment, garrison duty, police work. The same role we had been performing on Praxis 3, but now official, acknowledged, assigned through proper channels. The system had determined our function. We would perform it. We shipped out 2 weeks later. Another transport, another warp transit, another arrival at a world that needed us only as instruments of control. Helix 7 was gray, its atmosphere thick with particulate from mining operations that had continued for 3 centuries without pause. The workers extracted promethium from deep shaft mines, dangerous work that killed hundreds annually. They were growing dissatisfied with conditions. The planetary governor needed forces to maintain order. We would be those forces. I walked the perimeter of our new garrison on our first night planetside, looking at a sky I could barely see through atmospheric haze, breathing air that tasted of chemicals and despair. 36 months since deployment. 3 years. I was 26 years old. I remembered being 23, remembered believing in purpose, remembered certainty. Those memories belonged to someone else, a person I had been before I understood what service actually meant. Oren found me on the perimeter. He always found me. "You're thinking about leaving," he said. Not a question. Never a question with him. "I don't know what I'm thinking anymore. If you run, they'll hunt you. Commissariat doesn't forgive desertion. You know that. I know. Not for the Imperium. Not for the Emperor. Stay because I'm asking you to. Because these 3 years have been tolerable because you've been in them. Because I don't want to do this alone." I looked at him, saw what I had not allowed myself to see before. Not just friendship, not just connection. Something deeper, more essential. Oren had kept me alive in ways that had nothing to do with physical survival. He had maintained me as a person when the system was processing me into a component. He was asking me to stay, not as a soldier, as whatever we were beneath the uniforms and the indoctrination and the machinery. "Okay," I said. "I'll stay. For me, for you." He nodded. Something in his posture relaxed. Tension I had not noticed, releasing. We stood on the perimeter together, watching the gray sky, breathing toxic air, existing in a universe that wanted nothing from us except continued function. But we were functioning together. That was something. That was more than I had any right to expect. We served on Helix 7 for 4 years, suppressed 3 worker uprisings, maintained order through presence and threat and occasional applications of violence that I logged as necessary operations but understood as cruelty. The workers were not enemies. They were humans pushed beyond endurance by systems that extracted everything they had and demanded more. We were the instruments of extraction, enforcers for machinery that cared nothing for those it consumed. I understood what I was doing. I did it anyway, because Oren was there, because I had made a choice to stay, and staying required function, and function meant following orders regardless of their moral weight. In the 4th year on Helix 7, we received new deployment orders. The regiment would transfer to Caltus Prime, another garrison assignment. More suppression work, same machinery operating in a different location. We shipped out, we arrived, we performed our function. Oren and I stood watch together, played regicide in the evenings, maintained the connection that made continuation possible. He was graying now, stress and time marking him physically. I was too. We were aging in service, becoming the veteran soldiers we had once looked to for guidance. Men joined our regiment fresh from training. We taught them what survival looked like in a universe without meaning. Some learned, some broke. The cycle continued. 7 years since deployment. I was 30 years old. The war we had been supposed to fight had been over for nearly a decade. We had never fought it. We had spent those years performing garrison duties, enforcing order, serving as tools of control rather than instruments of humanity's survival. Everything I had believed about service had been stripped away by direct experience of what service actually entailed. I was complicit. I had enforced orders I knew were wrong. I had suppressed workers who had legitimate grievances. I had maintained systems that consumed people. I could not claim innocence. The choice to stay, to continue functioning, had made me part of the machinery I had once believed was righteous. Oren got sick in our 8th year. Nothing dramatic, just persistent illness that the Medicae could not diagnose or cure. He grew thin, his skin taking on a gray pallor that matched the skies of Helix 7. He continued his duties as long as he could, standing watch, conducting patrols, training new soldiers. But I observed him weakening, energy draining from him like slow hemorrhage. The Medicae gave him stimulants to maintain function. They worked for a while. Then they stopped working. He collapsed during morning formation in our 9th year. I was standing beside him when it happened, watched him drop without warning, body simply ceasing to support itself. The Medicae took him to the field hospital. They ran diagnostics. They consulted with senior medical staff via long-range Fox. They gave me their assessment 3 days later. Systemic organ failure, cause uncertain, likely accumulated exposure to environmental toxins across multiple deployments. Prognosis, terminal. Estimated survival, 2 to 4 weeks. I sat with him in the hospital ward. It was clean, sterile, equipped with medical technology that could diagnose but not cure. He was conscious, lucid, gray eyes clear despite the body failing around them. "I need you to do something for me," he said. His voice was weak, breath shallow. "When I'm gone, I need you to keep going. Not for the Imperium. Not for any of this. Just because you promised me once that you'd stay. That promise doesn't end when I do. I don't know if I can. You can. You've been doing it for 9 years. You'll do it for 9 more, and 9 after that. You'll outlast this. You'll see what comes next. Promise me." "I promise," I said. The words felt like betrayal, like abandoning him. But he was asking, and I could not refuse him. He died 6 days later. I was holding his hand when his breathing stopped, when the vital sign monitors flatlined, when the consciousness behind those gray eyes extinguished like a candle in void. I registered the moment with clinical precision. 23:17 hours, standard Imperial time. The Medicae recorded the death, logged the body for processing, updated the regimental roster. Oren became a casualty statistic, one among billions, absorbed into the vast archive of the Imperium's dead. They gave me his effects in a sealed container. Personal items, journal, the regicide set we had played with for 9 years. I took them to my bunk, placed them in my footlocker beside equipment I no longer cared about. I sat on my bunk. I stared at the container. I did not cry. I had forgotten how to cry somewhere in the 9 years. I just sat there, processing the absence, the sudden void where constant presence had been. Oren had kept me alive. Now he was data, archived, processed, gone. And I had promised him I would continue. I continued, not because I believed, not because I had purpose, but because I had given my word to a dead man, and honoring that word was the only meaning I had left. I performed my duties with mechanical efficiency. I trained new soldiers. I suppressed uprisings. I enforced orders. I became the thing I had observed in others years ago, a machine that looked like a person, executing protocols without inhabiting them. Time passed. Years blurred together, undifferentiated except by planet names and garrison assignments. Helix 7, Celtus Prime, Brennus Station, Mordant Nikes. Each deployment identical in function, maintain order, suppress dissent, serve as visible reminder of Imperial authority. I did not connect with the new soldiers who joined our diminished regiment. Connection required investment, and investment required believing that connection would not be torn away by death or disease or the simple grinding of time. I had learned that lesson. I would not learn it again. In my 15th year of service, we received orders to return to Segmentum Pacificus. The regiment would garrison Praxis 3, the agri-world where our misdeployment had begun. Full circle. The administratum's dark humor, unintentional and perfect. We navigated back to the system where we had wasted 18 months waiting for corrected orders. The planet looked exactly as it had when we left. Endless wheat fields, red sun, clean air that smelled of growing things. Nothing had changed. We had changed. We had aged, diminished, transformed from soldiers into enforcers, but the planet and its cycles continued without reference to us. They assigned us to the same garrison complex we had occupied before. The structures were unchanged, maintained by the planetary government for potential future use. I recognized the barracks, the equipment storage, the field chapel where I had lost my faith 15 years prior. My bunk was in the same position. The ceiling had the same rivets. I counted them. 37. Constants in a universe where nothing else remained constant. I am 41 years old now. I have served the Astra Militarum for 23 years. The war I was conscripted to fight ended before I ever reached it, concluded by other soldiers while I waited for bureaucracy to correct a clerical error. I spent those years enforcing order, suppressing resistance, serving as an instrument of control. I have done things I cannot justify. I have followed orders I knew were wrong. I have become exactly what the system required me to be. A tool that functions without question, that maintains itself, that continues operating long after the person inside the uniform has been processed away. I play regicide sometimes, alone, moving pieces for both sides. I win every game now. There is no one left to play against. The regiment has been reduced through attrition to 347 soldiers, remnants of the original 1800 who deployed from Brest the Old. Most are dead. Some deserted. A few went mad. The survivors are machines like me, functional but empty, executing protocols because protocols are all that remain. I do not pray anymore. I do not believe in the Emperor or his protection, or any of the theological framework I was indoctrinated with. I believe in the Imperium because the Imperium is undeniable, vast and eternal and consuming. It will process me as it processed Jace and Orin, and everyone else who has passed through its machinery. It will reduce me to components, recycle what is useful and discard what is not. That is not injustice. That is simply function. But I keep going, not because I have hope, not because I have faith, but because I promised Orin I would. And that promise is the last piece of humanity I retain. Every morning I wake. Every morning I perform my duties. Every evening I return to barracks, sit on my bunk, and stare at ceiling rivets. 37 of them. I count them every night. Then I sleep. Then I do it again. The Imperium is eternal. Service is eternal. I am a component in machinery that will outlast me, that will consume me, that will continue after I am processed into archive data. I understand this. I accept this. I participate in this. I am complicit. This is testimony. This is what service costs. This is what remains after 30 years of clerical error and bureaucratic processing and the slow recognition that purpose is not provided by systems, only demanded by them. I am still here. I am still breathing. I count rivets every night. 37 rivets. The number never changes. I continue.